there, Swan Shadow here. Welcome to the Nest. This video is the introduction to the Steely Dan 64 project. It's a series of videos that represents my attempt from a fan's perspective to rank the 64 songs of Steely Dan's classic period, beginning with the songs on the album Can't Buy a Thrill, released in 1972, and ending with those on Gaucho, released in 1980. Now, I believe without fear of contradiction that every single one of these 64 songs is of outstanding quality and worthy of repeated listening. That's a statement I don't believe can be made about many popular music acts with discographies of similar size. Maybe no other act. Let's get into some context. The musical partnership called Steely Dan, it's not quite accurate to say band, at least not for most of their history, holds a unique place in my consciousness. I've often told friends that Steely Dan got me through college, and that is absolutely true. No other recording act spent as much time in my speakers and headphones during those critical years of my life as did Donald Fagen, the late Walter Becker, and the ever-changing cast of truly legendary musicians they assembled to make this unparalleled run of albums. There are countless bands and solo artists whose work I love, but the 7 studio albums released by Steely Dan from 1972 through 1980 stand out for me in a special way. Now, I wouldn't claim that even those 7 records are the greatest ever. Music, like all forms of art, is subjective. It would be a fool's errand to make objective comparisons about anything so dependent on the individual tastes of the observer. And there are plenty of specific songs and performances that I treasure as much, if not in some cases more than, anything in the Steely Dan catalog. Suffice it to say that these 7 albums form a body of work that has resonated with me deeply for decades. In preparation for this video series, I've spent many hours revisiting these records and considering each component in a way that I never really had during my 4+ decades of listening to this music. And that's how I came to the Steely Dan 64 project. See, here's the thing. The Beatles, just to cite one example, were arguably the most important band of the rock era. But you and I both can name some undeniably terrible songs the Beatles released for public consumption. I mean, just between you and me, maybe a third of the White Album is like, what were they thinking? So when I think of all the other bands I particularly enjoy, every last one of them put out at least one truly embarrassing clunker of a tune. And in most cases, they put out several such clunkers. Sometimes a whole album of clunkers. It's a credit to these 2 notoriously anal retentive guys, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, that they never let a single stinker of a song clutter up Steely Dan's published repertoire during their prime years. Now, that isn't to say they weren't capable of making a stinker. The very first single released under the Steely Dan name is a song called Dallas, and it's complete garbage, and it's not like anything that came after it. The B-side of that single, a song called Sail the Waterway, might be marginally better, but only marginally. But Becker and Fagen had the good sense never to allow that junk to deface one of their studio albums. From the first note of Can't Buy a Thrill to the last note of Gaucho, everything in between is solid gold. Having said that, the fact that I find all 64 songs in the classic period of the Steely Dan repertoire worthwhile doesn't mean that I love all of them equally. What I set out to do in this series of videos is rank these 64 songs in order of my personal preference, and to talk a bit about the reasons why each song lands where it does on my list. I want to emphasize, this ranking is purely a subjective, individualized analysis. Your mileage will and should vary. And I also want to point out that my ordering makes no real attempt to be qualitative. I'm not a musician. I don't have the knowledge, the talent, or the training to deliver that kind of technical assessment. So what you're going to find here is my gut level perspective as a fan of the music. The fact that one track occupies a higher slot on my list than another doesn't mean that the musicianship or the songwriting, the arranging, or the production on either track is better or worse. It just means that I like the higher ranked song better, or at least I did at the exact moment when I pronounced this list closed. If I rewrote the list again, no doubt some things would move up or down. That's how music works. It's all about how it connects with you in the moment. Note also that this ranking does not include any of the songs from Steely Dan's two latter period albums, Two Against Nature, released in 2000, and Everything Must Go, released in 2003. Both of those albums are worthy additions to the Steely Dan discography. Two Against Nature, a good bit more worthy than Everything Must Go, in my opinion. But I don't have the same long-term relationship with those latter two albums that I have with the classic period recordings. That makes it tough for me to judge them on the same level, so I just didn't try. You should absolutely check out those two albums though if you're not familiar with them, and we'll probably talk about them in some future videos if enough of you are interested. But that's enough introduction. Over the next few videos, I will present my ranking of the Steely Dan 64. What I want you to do is think about where each of these tracks would rank for you personally. Again, we're going to disagree on the placement. That's totally cool. There's no right or wrong here. This is just me sharing what I think and feel about this music that has meant so much for me over my lifetime. What you think and feel about this music is equally valid. Where I hope we're going to agree is that it's fun to revisit these legendary tracks, relive some memories, and reflect on the incredible vision and uncompromising genius of Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. As we get into this, remember, this ranking is strictly a representation of my personal opinions about these songs, as someone who's been an avid Steely Dan fan since the 1970s. Your order can, will, and indeed should be different from mine. It's not my mission to tell you what you should think about this music. I'm just sharing what I think. Music hits all of us differently. That's why we call it music. So without further ado, here's my song number 64. The lowest song in my ranking, number 64, is Through with Buzz, track number 7 on the 1974 album Pretzel Logic. Look, something had to be at the bottom of the list, right? In this case, it's Through with Buzz. Fortunately, it doesn't take us very long to be through with Buzz. At a hair over a minute and a half, this is by far the shortest song in the Steely Dan catalog. Because it's so short, it feels a bit like a throwaway. I wonder if maybe there was at some point more to the song than what we got, but perhaps Becker and Fagen just decided to strip it down to the bare essentials. Or it could be that they began working on the tune, got it to this point, and said, yeah, that's good enough. Now, to me, that seems counter to the usual Becker and Fagen perfectionist MO, but there are exceptions to every rule. Still, Through with Buzz has a great vocal by Fagen and a rare use of strings on a Steely Dan record. I think FM is the only other Steely Dan track from this period that showcases strings. Now, one cultural note, Fagen's tossed off homophobic slur hasn't aged very well. So, yeah, let's be through with that. Song number 63 is Daddy Don't Live in That New York City No More, the fourth track on the 1975 album Katie Lied. And I don't have a lot to say about this one. I kind of feel sorry for Lucy, the main character in the lyric. Lucy still loves her Coke and rum, but she sits alone because her daddy can't come. The reason why Lucy's daddy departed the Big Apple remains a mystery. Just between you and me, I suspect he's probably doing hard time upstate. Song number 62 is Brooklyn Owes the Charmer Under Me, track 8 on Steely Dan's 1972 debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill. I'm going to be honest here. My antipathy for country music, an oxymoronic phrase if ever there was one, is well documented. and the instrumentation on Brooklyn veers ever so slightly too far in a country direction for my personal taste. We get occasional hints of that in very early Steely Dan. In fact, Dallas, the very first single released under the Steely Dan brand name, which is not included in this ranking because it predates Can't Buy a Thrill, is pretty much a straight-up country pop tune. In the case of Brooklyn, there's something weirdly dissonant about the sort of Nashville light instrumental arrangement butted up against the smooth, soulful vocal trio of Vanetta Fields, Clyde King, and Shirley Matthews. The ladies actually sound like Brooklyn to me. The rest of the song, not so much. I do have to give kudos, though, to the pedal steel guitar work by Jeff "Skunk" Baxter. It's probably my favorite element of this track, which is strange, I know, because I already said I don't dig the country thing. But the pedal steel by Skunk really delivers here, really works. Like a lot of Steely Dan fans, I'm not generally in love with David Palmer on lead vocals, but I think he's fine here. And no, I have no idea why Brooklyn owes anyone anything. Song number 61 is Charlie Freak, track number 10 on the 1974 album Pretzel Logic. You might be sensing a theme here. A lot of the songs from side 2 of Pretzel Logic are going to wind up in the lower portion of my ranking. They're not bad songs by any means, but I do feel that they don't pop for me as much as the rest of the catalog. Charlie Freak is a solid song. It's tightly written and performed. Donald Fagen's pulsing piano riff alone makes it worth the price of admission. For me, Charlie Freak ranks this low mostly because it's dark and angsty and depressing. It's the sordid tale of a youthful drug addict who's dead by the final verse. Granted, Steely Dan did a lot of material that's not exactly cheerful or uplifting, but their more morose numbers are usually redeemed by an arch joke here or a witty turn of phrase there or, something. Charlie Freak is just sad. And on a personal note, Charlie Freak reminds me of Charlie X, one of my least favorite episodes of the original Star Trek series, which is also about a weird kid named Charlie who could be described as a freak and comes to an unfortunate, although in that case not fatal, end. That connection probably doesn't help me love this song any better. Sorry, Charlie. Song number 60 is Turn That Heartbeat Over Again, the 10th and final track on the 1972 debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill. The most noteworthy aspect of this song is that it features a rare lead vocal by Walter Becker, who joins with both Donald Fagen and David Palmer in the singing of this one. That shared lead vocal is something Steely Dan almost never did, so it stands out as interesting here. At this early stage, Fagen still wasn't totally comfortable with the sound of his vocals, so he was willing to try some different approaches. And hey, the lyrics mention my name and Jesus together in the same repeated line. I have to give it at least one bonus point for that. Song number 59 is Rose Darling, the third track on the 1975 album Katy Lied. Becker and Fagen didn't write very many unapologetic, pure love songs. Rose Darling is one of their very few, and I like it for that reason. It's nice to get some fresh, unjaded emotion from these two guys. This is the first song in our ranking to this point where we get the unmistakable backing vocals of Michael McDonald. It's funny because McDonald's voice has become so associated with the Steely Dan sound, it's easy to forget he doesn't show up until the fourth album. And even then, he's not really featured on all that many of their tunes going forward. That just speaks to the distinctive flavor that McDonald's vocals add, so that a little really does go a long way. Also, we get an appropriately sweet guitar solo here from Dean Parks. Parks is one of those players who always gives you just enough and never too much. Perfectly understated, but perfectly memorable at the same time. What else do you want from a love song? Song number 58 is With a Gun, the 9th track on the 1974 album Pretzel Logic. Becker and Fagen's songwriting is often described as cinematic. That's perhaps nowhere more evident than on With a Gun, which is more or less high noon, Steely Dan style. Something about this one reminds me of the better songs, and yes, there are a few, on the Eagles' early records. It's similar thematically to the kinds of things that Don Henley and his compadres were writing in their pre-Hotel California period, before Joe Walsh showed up and propelled them into being an actual rock band. But distilled through the modern urban sensibilities of Steely Dan, that Old West desperado stuff takes on a darker and, should I say, funkier flavor. This is another one of those tracks from Pretzel Logic that represent Becker and Fagen's last genuine attempt at Steely Dan being an actual band that recorded simple, radio-friendly, 3 minutes or less pop rock tunes. There would be an increasing acceleration away from this sort of thing, beginning with Katy Lied. Speaking of which, song number 57 in our ranking is Chain Lightning, track 8 on Steely Dan's 1975 album Katy Lied. Back at number 59, I noted that Becker and Fagen didn't write many straight-up love songs. In a similar vein, there aren't very many straight-up blues numbers in the Steely Dan discography. But Chain Lightning is one. Yet, because this is Steely Dan, even a blues tune can't just be a blues tune. This one uses what sounds like basic blues chording, but isn't quite. It's more like a cruise through the intersection of blues and modern jazz, so that it retains the identity of both styles, but isn't entirely in either camp. The result is a groove so smooth and buttery that it's amazing that the original vinyl record didn't slide off the turntable. And does it get any more tasty than Rick Derringer's guitar solo? No, it does not. That's the genius of Becker and Fagen, perceiving that a guy better known as a rock player could master this kind of bluesy, jazzy, groovy delivery as icing on this particular cake. Like the song says, it's chain lightning. It feels so good. So that's the first chunk of our Steely Dan 64 ranking. 8 songs, none of which suck, but which begin to hint at the greatness that lies further up the list. In our next video, we'll explore the 8 rungs that are next up the ladder, the songs that I've ranked from 56 through 49. Click the link in the description and I'll meet you there. But before you take off, it would be awesome if you would tap that thumbs up to like this video. And while you're tapping, why not subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the content that's coming up. Thanks so much. Until next time, be well, stay steely, and hey, is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car.